Hello, everybody. Good morning. We will just wait a few more moments to let some others join the session, as I can see the numbers are rapidly going up, which is brilliant to see. And we'll just give it a moment. So feel free to take some time, get a tea, get a coffee. It's a little earlier in the GMT time zone for us here, so definitely time to wake up before the session.
Whereas it's 7 p.m. here in Australia.
Yeah, nearly bedtime.
Yes.
Sun going down.
Nice.
Okay, I think we'll get going and then others can join as the session continues. So hello everybody and welcome to the 6th episode of our Tandem Talks. So I think we have a few returning visitors today, which is great as the community grows. But for those of you that are new to joining us, our Tandem Talks is our thought leadership content webinar series, which takes place every month. And it's where we invite thought leaders, business leaders, and HR leaders to join us and share their expertise and their insights. So today we are delighted to be joined by Siobhan McHale, who will be talking to us about how to create an adaptive, high-performing culture in turbulent times. Siobhan is the author of a book called The Insider's Guide to Culture Change, which I'm sure many of you have already read, and has been the executive in charge of cultural transformations of a series of multinational organisations. So thank you for joining us. This session is meant to be interactive, so please feel free to use the chat box and the Q&A below. And we will come around to your questions for 15 minutes at the end of the session. And the final note from me is to just let you know that this webinar will be being recorded. So I'd now like to hand over to Aisling Tayar, who is the CEO of our Tandem. I hope you all enjoy. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, or good evening to Siobhan. Great to have you all with us. We're operating off two ends of a time zone difference here, so great to have you all join in. I'm really excited to hear what Siobhan is going to say. I know there's a lot of culture vultures in the audience who love the topic of culture and can't wait to get stuck in. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Siobhan to open us up and talk about the topic. And then we're going to go into a Q&A and comments and discussion. So please join in as we go through, as Siobhan piques your interest. Please do join in, add your comments, your thoughts, your inspiration, and indeed your questions, and we'll get to all of those when Siobhan gets through the first part. So can't wait. Over to you, Siobhan. I'll come off camera for a while.
Great. Thank you so much, Aisling, for the introduction. And as you can probably guess from my accent and maybe my name, I'm originally from Ireland, and I've lived in Australia now since 1994. And my career was really in two halves. I spent the first half of my career as a management consultant, so essentially flying across 4 continents, in and out of hundreds of different workplaces, helping leaders at all levels to create more constructive and productive workplace cultures. And then after a decade as a consultant, I was yearning for something more, actually. I wanted to roll up my sleeves and actually do change, do culture change, and make change happen within organizations. So I took a U-turn at that stage in my career and moved into human resources and became the executive in charge of change in a series of multinational organizations. And really one of the things I wanted to do in writing my book, The Insider's Guide to Culture Change, was to speak from that role of an insider, that role within human resources, actually making the change happen alongside leaders within the business. Because I've been looking at the shelves and sort of thinking, well, where are the practical books from people who have done change? And a lot of great books have been written by outsiders, whether they be academics or journalists or external consultants, which had a great perspective on change, but not that insider perspective. So that's really what I've written from, that insider perspective of rolling up your sleeves and doing change with leaders every day. And it's what I'll be speaking from that perspective or that lens today. And really, I think it is an opportune time for HR to be stepping into this role, helping to shape our businesses as we go through these pandemic times. And it reminds me of a recent conversation I had with an HR manager at a hardware organization who was really looking for my advice about how he could help to create faster change with less noise. And what was happening in the organization when we started to diagnose it was that it wasn't a technical issue. It was more that within the organization, decisions were being slowed down because all decisions seemed to be escalated to the senior executive team. So the pattern running that organization was that key decisions are made by the executive team, and that pattern was slowing things down and creating bottlenecks when it came to digital transformation. But seeing that pattern allowed the HR manager to step into a different role to start to accelerate the change within the organization. So the reason I'm sharing this is I think we're at an opportune time as an HR community to start stepping into our change role more fully and to help managers at all levels who are looking to us for advice. So they're actually sitting around the management table and saying, how can we adapt more quickly in these disruptive times? And I believe HR has a critical role to play in that faster adaptation. So I would like to share some slides with you as I talk through this critical role that we do play in disruptive times. So this is the topic of my conversation with you today, creating more adaptive workplaces and how do we actually do that. I've talked to you a little bit about my background and my role. So what I'd like to take you through today is 3 case studies. And the first of those case studies about how we can take up our change role relates back to Nokia. And for those of you who can remember, Nokia was the poster child for mobile phones and for innovation in the 1990s. But by the early 2000s, its star had faded. And by 2013, Nokia had actually been taken over by Microsoft. So it had gone from this stellar poster child, its brand was really known for innovation, to being bought out by Microsoft. So how did this decline occur? Now, you might speculate, oh, it didn't have the right technology. But that wouldn't be entirely correct because Nokia had the smartphone technology to compete with Apple, but it failed to leverage that smartphone technology because of cultural issues, but it didn't identify those issues. The first culture issue that it failed to identify was the fact that it didn't have a diverse culture. Most of the senior executives and the managers within Nokia came from Finland, its home country, and they had grown up there, they had been educated there, and they had stayed there for their whole lives. So they had quite a myopic view of the world, and they failed to see the threat that Apple was posing with its iPhone technology that was fast approaching on the horizon. So diversity and lack of diversity was a critical ingredient in its downfall. The second factor was the fact that the culture at Nokia had become complacent. It was once an organization that was known for innovation, but it started to focus more on servicing its phones than it did on innovating and creating new products. And that culture of complacency where they believed that they were the kingpins and they ruled the world started to have an impact on its ability to compete in the marketplace. The third factor at Nokia that was related to its culture was that Nokia had quite a siloed culture. And within the organization, the hardware engineers who made the actual hardware of the phone saw themselves as being in charge, and the software engineers who built the apps within the phones were put in a secondary position. So hardware engineers in charge, software engineers seen as the second-class citizens. What was happening at Apple, on the other hand, was that the hardware engineers and the software engineers were working together on phones with apps that absolutely wowed the customers. So you had this much more collaborative culture with people working side by side to create products that absolutely took the market by storm. So that is the first case study that I wanted to introduce you to, that if Nokia had been looking out for these themes and these trends and had an HR team that was able to point out what was going on by stepping onto what I call stepping onto the bridge. So one of the things I talk about in my book is the importance of stepping onto the bridge when you're in change. What do you think you might see if you stepped onto the bridge? You would have a very different view probably than you would do if you were standing on the deck. So on the bridge, you can see the waves, you can see the clouds on the horizon, you can see the distant shores, you can see the opportunities and the landscapes that are emerging on the horizon. You have a different view. And this is one of the roles that I think HR can play, is that we can step onto the bridge and we can start to see the patterns that are emerging that can potentially stop us from adapting. Which brings me to the second case study that I'd like to share with you today. And this is the case study of the Australia and New Zealand Bank, where I spent 9 years actually helping the bank to transform itself. And when I walked into the bank in the early 2000s, what I noticed was an organization that was different in different parts. So the organization as a whole had the lowest customer satisfaction ratings in the country of any big bank. And staff satisfaction was very low, very disengaged staff, and basically a community within Australia that you know, a national sport was bank bashing. So community outrage at how the banks were behaving, their high fees, their lack of transparency. And the CEO realized, John McFarlane at the time realized, he had to do something more than just a technical solution. He had to fundamentally change the culture of the bank. So I walked in, I took over several years later as head of the bank's transformation program, which was called Breakout. And that program actually has become a case study used by John Kotter at Harvard Business School to teach MBA students about how to manage change. So one of the things I did when I walked into the bank is simply walk around. And what do you notice when you walk around, you start to pick up what's really going on in the organization. What I noticed in head office was that there were plush carpets as you walked into the foyer, beautiful plush rugs. There were marble pillars that sort of reached up into Gothic ceilings. There were beautiful big open plan offices with sweeping views out to the bay. However, a visit to the 700 branches, well, some of the branches, revealed a very different story later on that week. The branches had paint peeling from the walls. Some of them even had holes in the ceilings where water was dripping through. There were long queues with customers who waited in line and didn't get answers often to their queries. So a very different world between the head office and the branches, and a different role that they were taking up. So one of the things that you noticed in the bank was that head office were in role of order giver. So they basically gave the directions, then they told the branches what to do. And the role that the branches were taking up in the culture was that of order taker. So waiting for instructions, feeling like that things were done to them, and very much in a victim mode. So one of the things to notice in this is, what is the pattern or the agreement between the parts? So rather than focusing on individual behaviors, it's really important in change work and in culture change work in particular, that you see the patterns that connect, or the agreements between the parts, as I call them. And the agreement between these two parts in the ANZ example was that you are to blame for the poor customer service. So the branches blamed the head office and said it's their fault, they're not getting back to us with the decisions. And head office, on the other hand, blamed the branches and said, well, we've got poor customer service because the branches aren't taking up their role. And round this pattern of blame went. And essentially that was one of the reasons that we had the worst customer satisfaction in the rates in the country. What we did was implement a new operating model and reframe the roles of the parts at ANZ. So we reframed the role of head office to support provider and reframe the role of the branches to service provider. And what we started to see was a different pattern emerging, which was working together to serve the customer. So again, you start to see this theme of patterns, the patterns that connect and the patterns or the agreements between the parts. And these patterns show up everywhere. They show up in nature, in different ecosystems, whether it be the beautiful face of a sunflower or the stars in the Milky Way or the sand dunes in the Sahara Desert. We know that these ecosystems have formulas that govern them and that they are not chaos. They are chaotic systems that have underlying rules and underlying patterns that we can detect mathematically. These patterns show up in our families, and we know we have generational patterns that are hard to break out of, whether could be alcoholism, it could be abuse, but then you get individuals who manage to break out of these patterns and to change the trajectory of their lives. So really important in culture work to see these patterns and to diagnose these patterns. And that brings me to the third case study, which was an infrastructure company called Build It Pro. And essentially, Build It Pro was an organization where they managed very large infrastructure projects. And what we noticed there was the CEO, Ben Harkness, was very worried about the financial performance of the organization, very worried that his contracts were losing money. And actually, when we looked at what was going on there, what we saw was that there were different roles, actually. This was what we found initially, that Ben was in the role of Mr. Nice Guy, and his managers were in role of project underachievers. And actually, the big pattern that was running the organization was that being liked is more important than achieving. So people were taking their cue from Ben. They were all stepping into role of Mr. Nice Guy. Nobody was taking difficult performance decisions. There were no consequences. And essentially, everybody was underachieving. And deadlines were slipped, mistakes were being made. People who had underperformed were being moved around without any consequences. So seeing this pattern was incredibly important to rewiring that pattern. So essentially, once we could see the pattern, we could change the pattern, and we started to put Ben and other managers into the role of performance manager and managers into the role of project managers. And the new pattern that started to emerge was that relationships and contract performance are important. So it was an and, not an either or. So stepping out of role of relationship managers and being liked and into role of performance manager was really important in this whole change. And within 18 months, actually, contract performance had significantly improved in the organization, and the majority of the contracts were running back in the black. So they had gone from being in the red to being in the black. The same thing with the ANZ. Within 7 years, the bank had gone from the worst performing bank in the country to the #1 bank globally on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. It had gone from the worst performing bank in terms of customer satisfaction to the #1 bank in the country for customer satisfaction. Engagement levels turned around from being a place where most people didn't want to work to being a highly engaged culture. So this 4-step approach that I talk about in my book, for those of you who don't know about it, is called the Culture Disruptor. It really is a toolkit for HR professionals to start to see these underlying patterns or agreements between the parts, and to step into your role to equip managers to not just see these patterns, but break these patterns. So I could talk some more about that, but really I just wanted to maybe take a break. I've been talking now for about 20 minutes. So I might just pause at that stage now that we've looked at the case studies and sort of open the conversation up for some, for some dialogue actually.
Siobhan, that was fascinating. And I love this concept of spotting patterns and changing them. I see questions are starting to pour in, so I'll get to those in a moment. Thanks, Nicole. There's one thing though that I'm burning to ask you, because I see it a lot. You know, a lot of people who talk to us, they are desperately trying to change their cultures. They know that what they have isn't what they want for the future. But many of them have been working there a long time, and while they want to change the culture, they're not maybe diagnosing those patterns very accurately because they've been in it too long, and they're seeing sort of this world that they know needs to change, but just kind of lost as to how they can change it. Can you give any advice to anyone who finds themselves in those shoes? How do you objectively look at your own patterns? And then I'll get to the questions. I see them pouring in.
Yes, it's such a fantastic question, and it speaks, Aisling, to the fact that we can become blind to the patterns. It is easy to be caught by the patterns, and you only have to think about your own family. You know, some things that you might think are perfectly normal, because it's the way you've always done them in the family. Other people might visit your family, or maybe sometimes it might be a new partner that you introduce to your family, and they might think, wow, that's very strange.
Yeah.
It's a very strange way of doing things. Yeah. You McHales are very strange, they might say, because they have not done it that way before. I remember when I first came to Australia, for example, and I used to have a green basin in the sink, because that's what you did in Ireland. We always had a green basin, and you washed your dishes in the green basin. Came to Australia, and I was like, what are you doing with the green basin? And I said, but that's what you do. You have the green basin in the sink and you wash the dishes in the green basin. But of course, that was generational.
So Irish.
That's what you did. You always had the basin. And it didn't make any sense to me that you wouldn't have the green basin. So it's a bit like the green. And now I don't have a green basin anymore. I just put the plug in and wash the dishes in the sink. And I don't have that drama of having to wash the green basin as well as the sink. But you know, it's like the green basin. We can become so used to it we don't even see it. So there are ways to get out of that. And the thing I always say before you rush in, and I do it myself all the time, is I diagnose. I spend weeks diagnosing. I don't rush to solution. So I seek out, firstly, I take the balcony or the bridge perspective. I step onto the bridge deliberately, and I build it into my work plans. I refuse to come up with solutions until I have a 6-week diagnostic. And in that diagnostic, I step onto the bridge and I get multiple perspectives. So I get the view of the different parts. What is that part thinking? What is this part? What is this part? What is this part? And I start to map the views and the roles of the different parts. And if possible, I get another person with me who's not caught in it. Now, I can see these patterns because I'm probably very trained at it, but getting or tag teaming with an external consultant is really important. This is why, as an insider, having an external advisor who's not caught by the patterns, who's a trusted partner on that journey is so important, because they will see stuff and that's not what you do in other organizations necessarily. It's quite unique to you. So having that external advisor, absolutely invaluable, as well as the external advisor can sometimes say things that you're not able to say as an internal person. So they've got a bit of immunity. They can say stuff that maybe you can't say as easily. So that would be what I would say, but we've got to actually rewire our brains for patterns, not for single root cause, because that's how we've been trained. We just go back and back and back and back, and that's the problem. It's never that way with culture change.
Yeah, fantastic. I'm going to have to get through all these questions really quickly. There's loads pouring in. They're loving it, Siobhan. There's lots of compliments coming in. Best culture change presentation. It's all about getting to fundamental rules. Here's one from Cara. What advice would you give a HR leader whose CEO talks values and behaviors, but his own leadership shadow is one of passive aggressive behavior? Won't address what's happening in his own leadership team, so the wider organization mistrust if real change will really occur. I think that might be a familiar one for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's a very tricky one. I like to anchor everything that I do back to strategy. I don't approach it relationally. So I would be having a conversation with the CEO about what are the strategic goals, what are the business imperatives, what are the things you need to achieve, and what therefore are the patterns within the culture that we need to accelerate and those that potentially we need to break. And in that conversation, you'd be hoping that that emerges as one of the things that's going to prevent the organization from being a high-performing team. But I wouldn't be going into that conversation with the sort of values, waving the values flag or being the advocate for. I think a lot of people within human resources see themselves as, I've got to get the executive team understanding the power of culture or understanding what they're doing wrong. And actually that role isn't serving us as well as it might. If you see yourself as the enabler of the business goals and helping to build the culture that will help the organization to achieve the goals, actually what you're doing is joining up with the CEO. Rather than being in role of critic of the CEO. You're in role of joined upness. And from that role of really being joined up with him or her, you're in a much better position to eventually extend your influence, because you're not trying to persuade them about anything. You're just saying, right, you want to achieve growth in these territories, you want your market share to increase, you want new products, you know, in these markets. This is the cultural implication of that. And this is the plan for how we get there. And suddenly you're on their page. Yeah. You're not looking at culture through the lens of just engagement. You're looking at it as a business enabler. It's just a different role to step into rather than I've got to convince them that they need to change. If you can you hear that distinction? Whoever asked the question, and Aisling, I'm not criticizing that.
Where you're coming from. Yeah, because I think that is often the case. Is it's easy to see what's wrong in the leadership behaviors, and that's often, you know, a big challenge to be dealt with. And it's easy to jump into that role of, well, we need you acting this way, and can you act this way instead of that way, so that it snowballs down. But that's not always easy for people to do that. But as well, it doesn't always serve the cause of, because they don't see the link between their behavior and driving the business goals forward. Yeah.
Yes, and often that behavior that the CEO is demonstrating, the CEO is a part, so he or she is one part and a subsystem in and of themselves. What is the connectedness with the other part? Because the CEO is behaving in a certain role in relation to another part and the role that they're taking up. So, you know, being able to show them there, like I did with Ben, I said, because Ben was quite interesting, because I went into his office, the CEO of Build It Pro, and he was really frustrated. He said, Siobhan, I'm really annoyed. The culture change, you know, that you've just come in to help us with, it's going too slowly. And I just had another example this week. He said, my head of marketing, Brendan, he's useless. I've asked him 3 months ago to put up a billboard on the top of the building to advertise our services in the area. And 3 months later, he still hasn't done it, Siobhan. It's another example of the lack of accountability in this culture that I'm really fed up with. And I went, I can hear that. I can hear you're very frustrated, Ben. I said, what would you do then? What do you do then? The thing I decided to do was ask a question. I said, who have you spoken to about this delay? I said, I've spoken to my head of finance, I've spoken to the head of the supply chain, I've spoken to the, I've spoken to the shared services guy, went through them all and said, oh, okay. So you've spoken to everybody, but you haven't spoken to Brendan.
Oh, classic. Yeah, I love it.
And
I'm
his
gonna have to move us
jaw
on.
dropped.
Yeah, I
His
can
jaw
imagine.
dropped. I didn't have to say, you need to start the performance conversations. It was just like, okay, so just reflecting back, you've spoken to everybody, but you haven't spoken to Brendan. And his jaw dropped and he said, oh my goodness, I'm co-creating the pattern, Siobhan.
Yeah, absolutely. And Cara says thanks. She can see how the approach would work. Loads of questions flooding in, so we're going to have to get short and choppy with the answers.
Sorry, I'm banging on.
Move you on.
Sorry, manage me.
Nicole asks, how do you very practically go about breaking patterns?
Very practically, and I talk about this in the book, the power, well, there's a whole chapters on it, but one of the most powerful and underestimated ways is to reframe the role for faster change with less noise. The remarkable power of role reframing, and as you know, you step into multiple roles every day yourself. You might be in role of spouse or partner, role of parent, your behavior switches again, then you might go to work, you're in role of colleague, you're in role of boss, you're in role of subordinate, you're in role in a meeting of negotiator, collaborator, critic, encourager. All of these mental maps of our roles immediately impact our behavior. So you don't have to change somebody's personality. You can reframe their role for remarkably fast change. But there is a whole, there are probably 5 chapters in the book about practical tools to help break patterns, but that is one of my favorites.
Yeah, love that. From an anonymous attendee here, thanks for the presentation. What kind of tips could you share regarding a culture change happening while a big part of employees are in remote work? And I think that's a challenge a lot of people are facing right now.
Yeah, culture tips for remote working. I often say that during times of disruption, the cracks in your culture are even more apparent. So, for example, if you had a micromanaging culture in remote working times, you might even see a doubling down of micromanaging. So one of the things to do is create change that is leader-led. So create a group of leaders that basically sees its role and has the role to manage and lead the change, and work with that group, bringing them together on a regular basis to step onto the bridge and take regular looks at how are they intervening, what has been the response when they have an intervention, and how do they need to tack on that journey. So you're working with a leadership subgroup around how they are navigating and leading the change. So rather than it's just outsourced to HR or given to some steering committee, it's leader-led change.
Okay, brilliant. Mark makes some comments here. Thanks, Mark. Great case studies. I admit when you're in the thick of a company's culture, it can be extremely difficult to see the patterns of dysfunction. Perhaps it should come from a perspective of where are the pain points, what are the people complaining or whinging about? More importantly, what are they not saying or feeling confident to say to their superiors? Definitely an external perspective can start breaking the cycle. Thanks, Mark. Michelle's asking some questions here. How do you suggest changing culture where an organization is actually high performing, but still in a command and control style?
I would be again starting with strategy. So what are the strategic imperatives that are emerging, and what do they require of us? Because actually the command and control style has up until now served the organization very well. Otherwise it wouldn't be thriving. But what may be emerging on the horizon is that the organization needs to be much more agile. It may need to delegate decision-making down, but the leadership group need to see that. They need to diagnose it with you, and they need to agree that that would be the way they want to rewire the organization in order to deliver on their future growth plans, for example. So I would be linking it back to strategy, because that culture has served them.
Yeah, yeah. Sander asks a really interesting question here. Siobhan, my question in your examples, what ratio of employees have you been able to change versus how much of leadership personnel you actually had to change?
Sorry, what was the first part of that, Aisling?
What ratio of employees you have seen being able to change versus how much of leadership personnel you actually had to change?
Yeah, I think change the people or change the people comes to mind.
Yeah, I was thinking the same when I saw it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things I talk about is that you have to get to a tipping point within 18 months of the change. You've got to get the critical mass of people coming on board with the change, or else it's seen as a fad or something that people won't get on board with. But once you start to get that critical mass, what you find is that others who are not up for it or don't want this change, they will leave.
Yeah.
They will tend to self-select out. So I'm not as big a believer in, I'm a very big believer in reframing. And I think the reason why people often so-called resist change is that they have framed their role in a certain way. So for example, when I first came on board at Dulux Group, where I'm the EGM of HR, what I noticed was that there was, my team was in role of order taker. And you could say, oh, well, that's all they do. They're just transactional. They're just waiting to be told and just get rid of them. They're duds. But that wasn't the approach I took at all. I said, no, they're good people. They have potential. I'll reframe their role. So reframe the role, said you are actually business leaders with a deep functional expertise. And that reframing, and we've been on the journey now 5 years, but that reframing allowed them to see their role in a very different way, draw a different mental map of their role and step into that role, and to be supported in that stepping into the role. So we didn't need to say goodbye to anybody. We reframed and got really a lot of traction and faster change.
Oh, fantastic. That's such an encouraging story to hear that it can, because I think a lot of HR departments get trapped in that mindset of, oh, we just have to carry out the work that is asked of us, as opposed to we stand up and lead around here. So the idea that you can take it from there to there is fantastic, and I think inspiring for everybody. Helmut here has a question. From my experience, the key for excellent performance is a shift from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation. Did you observe the same? And if yes, how did you nurture intrinsic motivation?
Yeah, I think it's definitely one of the things that is very relevant that you need to, motivation is quite a complex and tricky process. And sometimes you can try and interfere with rewards or how people are motivated, and you actually find that you can lose some intrinsic motivation. I usually go back to what is the essence of our role. So I was working, for example, with a team that was doing water maintenance in a large city in Australia. So they were fixing the pipes, the burst water pipes, and doing maintenance on the network. And they were in a fight. The supervisors were fighting with the employees, and they were pointing the finger at each other, and it was very toxic. And one of the places that we started was coming back to what is your role? And essentially, everybody's role was to help to keep the people of the city safe from harm and to keep them healthy with the provision of clean water. And in generations prior, there had been, cholera in the city from, water that wasn't clean. So that was the binding force that allowed them to come back to the essence of their role and their purpose. And we started from there. And that went from a fractured pattern, a fracturing of, disrespect really was the pattern, to much more of a sense of unification. So I find that starting there with what is our ultimate role can help.
Yeah, I think what's, great about that example is finding people's purpose. We all are working toward the same purpose, and we have a clear purpose here together, and that overcomes all sorts, because we're all important in making a difference. I think that can be so powerful as a strategy to move people beyond their individual resentments. Mark, I'm getting late to this comment, so it might be a little out of context, but I think it's still really relevant. Mark says the problem with direct confrontation of behavior is that they will become really defensive and probably dismissive. Great point, Siobhan, to make it about the strategy and how you're approaching it rather than making it personal. And I think that was going back to a point you made formerly, Siobhan, but it was a great point, Mark. Abby asks, can you get change fatigue?
Yeah, you certainly can get change fatigue. And I think one of the roles of HR is to start to observe what's going on in the culture, in the system, and to bring those data points to the leadership group during change. So, I always say, it's the great philosopher Heraclitus actually said, you never step into the same river twice. And I do believe that with organizations during change, it's like this ever-flowing river. And part of the success in change is constantly checking in. How is it going now? Where are our people at? What do we need to watch for? What do we need to manage for? What do we need to lead for? And it was a bit like a Dulux group during in the height of last year in the pandemic, and we were in lockdown, and we had reframed everybody's role in the top 200 to be two things. You are a deliverer, a delivery leader, getting paint out there, out to the stores, out to the customers, and you're a growth leader. So delivery leader, growth leader, trying to grow into new markets. And what we noticed inadvertently was that this reframe, people just put the foot on the accelerator, and we started to see an increase in our safety incidents. And we looked at the report, and it said somebody had a strained ankle and a strain and strain and strain and strain. Everything was about strained. Somebody had sprained their ankle, strained their back, strained. It was just a whole system, a whole culture in strain. So what we had to do was to go back in with a second intervention to say, actually, you're a growth leader and a delivery leader with care.
Okay,
so
wow.
With care. And suddenly we went from one of the worst safety years on record to actually the best safety year on record, because we reframed in the middle of the year. We saw the pattern, we reframed it, we stepped in to intervene again, and just delivery leader with care, those two words, we called the top 200 together again onto another Zoom meeting and said, we want to refine the reframe. We want to say you were a delivery leader with care. We want to show you the data and show you all these descriptions of sprains and strains, and we want you to take care. And that was just the power of reframing, power of noticing, the power of intervening in time. And I brought that up with the CEO, and he went, oh my goodness, that's so clever. It's just seeing.
It's a lovely one.
Amazing.
Yeah. Love that. I'm going to tuck one last question in before I know Meg is going to shut us down in minutes. But Lorraine asks, how do you get the unwritten rules on the table?
Well, I think the unwritten rules to me are the patterns. And again, it's how do you see them? How do you diagnose them? And one of the things I do all the time is I don't emerge them. Because if I emerge them, that can bring up resistance. I think, I'm not sure who said that, but it was a very good point. So what I tend to do in a lot of my work is I will have a workshop. I will stand with a whiteboard and I will draw, okay, so here we have the branches, and I will wait for somebody to say, oh, the branches are in role of victim, the branches are taking the orders. And I'll say, oh, okay, so branches are in role of order taker. Okay, that's interesting, I'll draw it. What happens with head office? And eventually someone will say, oh, head office, they tell us what to do. And I say, okay, so head office are in role of order giver. What's the pattern? And somebody will emerge the pattern, or the pattern of the agreement between the parts is you'll be told what to do around here. Or people tell you what to do. Okay, so so I'm not telling them what it is so much. I mean, I know what it is, but I'm emerging it from them. So once it emerges from others, you don't get the resistance to, oh, Siobhan said, or Siobhan told us, or, HR have told us with this. So once you get better at this, you can emerge it from the system. And that's what you can do in a diagnostic. Your 6-week diagnostic, you can say, this is what we were told. This is what the people said anonymously. And that way you don't bring up resistance.
Yeah, love that. Siobhan, when Meg comes on screen, it means our time is up, but the comments continue to pour in, people thanking you for it, saying it's really interesting. They're really looking forward to reading your book. So you've certainly created a new fan base from Tandem Talks, but personally, I've really enjoyed hearing you speak on the topic. I could listen to you all day happily, but unfortunately I don't get to. Thank you so much for being a Tandem Talk guest. So over to you, Meg.
Fabulous, thank you. And thank you again, Siobhan. It was brilliant to hear. And thank you everyone for joining and for all of your engagement. The next Our Tandem Talk session will be on Tuesday, the 27th of April. And next time we will be joined by Laura Grealish, who is the co-author of Feedback and Other Dirty Words with Tamra Chandler. And that by popular demand, Tamra will be joining us again for the Q&A session. And Laura will be talking about how to build trust in your performance management strategies. So please follow us on LinkedIn. I'll just drop the link in the chat, and then you can keep up to date with the registration details. So thank you again for joining us. It was a great session and I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.